This conference, as you folks know very well, sits at the intersection of climate ambition, competitiveness, innovation, and ocean science. As was said in the introduction, I have had the honor of serving in 3 portfolios that are probably all relevant to this conversation. But before I got into politics in 2015, I also spent about 20 years running clean technology companies, including one in the water space as a chief executive officer. So I hope to offer a few thoughts based on those experiences that may be useful for you. In the next few minutes, I would like to speak about where we stand in the fight against climate change, the role of technology and government in moving us forward, and the place of carbon removal technologies in general and ocean alkalinity enhancement in particular. This meeting is happening at a challenging time for Canada and for the world as a whole. Successfully navigating through this period will require thoughtful, well-considered choices. Canada faced serious economic challenges even before the recent tensions we have had with our neighbors to the south. These include weak productivity growth, aging demographics, and a continued heavy reliance on the production and the export of raw natural resources. Conventional fuels in this country have contributed enormously to our prosperity. But as the world moves to reduce carbon emissions and avoid the worst impacts of climate change, and as important parts of the world increasingly move to reduce energy security risks that come from dependence on fossil fuel imports, and we see that happening each and every day right now with what's going on in the Persian Gulf, these products will no longer drive Canadian economic growth to the same extent. With respect to oil, demand in the developed world peaked several years ago, and global demand overall is expected to peak by the end of this decade. At the same time, President Trump's tariffs, including against key Canadian sectors, have worsened existing challenges and are forcing structural changes in the Canadian economy. These pressures demand that Canada build a more competitive, productive, and resilient economy, one where Canadians produce and consume more Canadian products, and where we diversify our export markets so that we are less dependent on the United States. On the environmental side, climate change is not going away. It is a scientific reality with increasingly significant economic and human costs each and every year. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere recently recorded the largest annual jump on record, reaching levels not seen in human civilization and driving more frequent and severe extreme weather. Climate change and its impacts are a matter of science, not politics. But how we choose to respond remain fundamentally political decisions. These challenges are real and significant, but there are indeed strong reasons to be optimistic. Canada needs to invest in projects and infrastructure that enable us to produce and consume more Canadian products here at home, breaking down internal barriers to trade and choosing Canadian where we can. It also means strengthening our ability to export efficiently to markets beyond the United States. And it means being clear about the sectors in which Canada can succeed at scale. That is where a focus on low-carbon products and technologies, on carbon competitiveness, as Julie said, comes in. Addressing climate change and building a strong future economy are, in my view, entirely complementary. Looking at actual global trends rather than listening to rhetoric, it is clear that the world is moving towards a lower carbon future and that many countries, China in particular, have explicit economic strategies to accelerate the energy transition. Progress is indeed being made, albeit more slowly than science would suggest we need. Growth in energy-related CO2 emissions is continuing to decouple from global economic growth. CO2 emissions in advanced countries fell by 1.1% in 2024, a level last seen 50 years ago, even though their cumulative GDP is now 3 times larger. Increasingly, progress on climate is being driven not simply by government policy, but by technology. And I think that's a really important point and something that we actually should celebrate. Solar and wind are now in many regions the lowest cost sources of new electricity, and costs continue to fall. Chinese solar panel and wind turbine prices, for example, are down 60% and 50% respectively since 2022. The same is true of heat pumps, which provide efficient heating and increasingly needed cooling. It may surprise you to know that in the United States, last year, heat pumps outsold natural gas furnaces by about 30%. Electric vehicles tell a similar story. In China, EVs are being manufactured for less than the cost of internal combustion engine vehicles. Their lifetime costs of ownership are significantly lower, and they are simply more fun to drive. Capital flows reflect this competitiveness. Of the roughly $3.3 trillion in projected 2025 capital investment in the energy sector, about $2.2 trillion is expected to go to renewables, nuclear, grids, storage, low-emission fuels, efficiency, and electrification, roughly twice as much as being invested in oil, natural gas, and coal. A few words about the role of technology. Addressing the climate challenge requires an economy-wide approach that tackles, first, the lowest cost technology emissions. It also requires governments to identify areas where further technology development, refinement, or cost optimization is needed before solutions can work environmentally and economically. Where effective, affordable commercial technologies already exist, such as heat pumps or EVs, government's role is largely to accelerate deployment. But in nascent areas, where science and environmental impacts are not fully understood, where regulation is incomplete, or where further testing and demonstration are needed, government has a significant role to play. Carbon removal technologies are one such area. Everyone in this room understands that carbon removal technologies must be part of any credible pathway to effectively addressing climate change. But carbon dioxide removal must be a complement to, not a substitute for, deep emissions reductions across all sectors. Carbon removal will be essential to address residual emissions in sectors where no viable reduction technology exists or where solutions are prohibitively expensive or logistically challenging. They will also be needed if the world overshoots CO2 levels consistent with limiting temperature rise to manageable levels, which the IPCC increasingly views as likely. Carbon dioxide removal includes approaches, as you know very well, including direct air capture, carbon mineralization, BECCS, reforestation and wetland rehabilitation, soil carbon sequestration, and ocean alkalinity enhancement, along with some other marine-based approaches. Several of these approaches are promising, but all face economic and environmental questions. Any carbon removal pathway must credibly be able to answer a few core questions. Is it safe for people and the ecosystem? Does it reduce CO2 permanently or at least for a very, very long period of time? Can it be done at reasonable cost? Can it scale to levels that are climatically meaningful? And to those questions, I would add a fifth question. Can it be measured, reported, and verified with a level of confidence that will stand up to scientific, public, and investor scrutiny? That is why early work in this space must focus not only on the technology itself, but on measurement, reporting, and verification, or MRV, and on public interest science and governance. Turning to the subject of this conference, Ocean Alkalinity Enhancement, or OAE, there are compelling reasons for Canada and the world to pursue further research and development. The relative simplicity of the underlying chemistry, the potential for a relatively low-cost, low-energy solution, and the possibility of scaling in ways that could have a meaningful impact on the climate challenge. Many, including the U.S. National Academies, have identified OAE as an important potential solution. A friend of mine who has played a leading role in the development of direct air capture and in the broader discussion around some of these emergent climate technologies recently suggested to me that, in his view, and he is a very well-informed person, there is a good chance that OAE can be one of the few carbon removal pathways that are very large scale and relatively low impact and cost competitive. However, important questions remain before governments, citizens, and investors can have confidence in its efficacy and in its long-term impacts. And this is where Canada has an important role to play, not because we should rush to conclude that OAE will become a major commercial solution, but because Canada has the scientific institutions, the regulatory culture, the ocean expertise, and ongoing project activity required to determine credibly whether, where, and under what conditions OAE deserves a place in a future climate toolkit. That is a research challenge, it is an MRV challenge, it is a governance challenge. And if the answers prove favorable over time, it may also become a significant commercialization opportunity. but those things need to proceed in the right sequence. Public trust and social license will matter enormously. Indigenous communities, coastal communities, fish harvesters, and the broader public will need to see that this work is being undertaken cautiously, transparently, and with appropriate safeguards. In the context of OAE, Canada is well placed to be an important enabler in this field. We have the longest coastline in the world and significant infrastructure on both coasts. We have world-class marine scientific capabilities in institutions including Dalhousie, the Ocean Frontier Institute, and the Centre for Ocean Ventures and Entrepreneurship, or COVE. We have a thriving ocean-based economy that includes companies in this emerging space, such as Planetary Technologies and Carbon Run, and innovation organizations, including the Supercluster, the Ocean Supercluster, which is based here. We are already hosting some of the most advanced real-world OAE research undertaken to date. We have rigorous science-based culture within DFO and across our research institutions. We have a workforce with deep experience in ocean-based industries, and federal and innovation tax measures that have already been used to support the development of other CDR technologies. We also have, here in Atlantic Canada, an emerging ecosystem in which philanthropies, startups, universities, public institutions, and governments are beginning to engage seriously on marine carbon removal. That ecosystem is not yet mature, but it is real, and if Canada is thoughtful, it can become globally relevant. OAE represents a potentially important additional tool in the fight against climate change, domestically and internationally. It also offers potential economic opportunity for Canada if we choose to lead. Studies suggest that marine CDR could generate significant economic benefits, including jobs, GDP growth, and exportable expertise. If a technology can be shown to be safe, effective, measurable, and scalable, we would want to see private capital and entrepreneurs at the table to help move it towards a market. But to get there credibly, the emphasis now has to be on research, demonstration, MRV, and governance. If those foundations are weak, commercial ambition will not be durable. If they are strong, commercialization can proceed in ways that build confidence rather than undermining it. For Canada to play a meaningful role in assessing and demonstrating and potentially commercializing OAE, it will require close collaboration between those in this room and government. To move this conversation forward at pace, my view is the federal government will need to develop a clear federal strategy, a research strategy for marine carbon dioxide removal, including OAE, consider targeted investments in research, demonstration, and MRV, establish a more coordinated governance and regulatory pathway for research scale activity, including robust monitoring and verification protocols, clarify how and when offset protocols or other market recognition tools might be considered, of course, once integrity and MRV questions have been satisfactorily addressed, and ensure that the role of CDR is more explicitly considered in future emissions reduction plans. In my view, one of the most practical early steps the federal government could take would be to establish a multi-departmental task force focused on marine carbon dioxide removal. This file does not sit neatly in one place. It spans DFO, Environment Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Justice, Global Affairs, and in some cases, central agencies and provinces. Without a formal mechanism to align these institutions, decision-making will remain fragmented and uncertain. Success will require cooperation across departments, and as I say, with relevant provinces. Within the federal system, you folks will know very well, DFO is critical for assessing impacts and regulatory measures. Environment Canada for emissions and environmental oversight, and NRCan for technology enablement and commercialization. The Senate Fisheries Committee and Carbon to Sea have both proposed such a multi-departmental task force. And while such a task force would be an important early step, as someone who has led all three of the most relevant departments, I would tell you that what you really need, if you want rapid progress, is a specific champion who will push this within the federal government. That champion does not need to presuppose that OAE is the answer. What you need is somebody who understands how technologies evolve, how governments manage risk, and how to move a file from interesting but uncertain to serious and structured. My advice to you is to engage, often and starting now. Find voices within the federal system who understand technology evolution and others who recognize the potential environmental and economic value of these solutions. Bring them in as observers, as partners, show how the work you are doing can contribute to climate and economic goals. Success in this field will depend on more than scientific promise or government and investor interest. It will depend on whether the work can withstand serious scrutiny and earn confidence from Indigenous communities, coastal residents, fish harvesters, regulators, and the broader public. Canada can play a leadership role in catalyzing international conversation and action, but getting Canada fully on board will, in large measure, depend on you. Let me just close by returning to the supposed choice between the economy and the environment, a choice that, in my view, is a completely false dichotomy. Yes, we face difficult economic and environmental challenges. Yes, we need to build a stronger Canada. But doing so requires that we address climate change clearly and boldly. I entered politics 10 years ago, largely because of climate change, after nearly 2 decades of leading companies that focused on addressing it through technology. I remain personally committed to the fight against climate change because of the threat it poses to the world that we will leave our children. But we cannot and should not rely on fear alone to build support for climate action. If we want to bring the vast majority of people with us, we must also be very clear about the enormous economic opportunities that exist if we thoughtfully and strategically redouble our efforts. We should also recognize that leadership is most compelling and most powerful when it looks to push the boundaries of human knowledge and experience. Canadians have been reminded of this recently through Jeremy Hansen's role in the Artemis II mission. Space exploration captures our imagination because it reflects courage, scientific excellence, and a willingness to venture into the unknown in service of a common global purpose. The challenge of climate change demands that same spirit. There is only one planet, and we have a shared responsibility to advance knowledge carefully, credibly, and with humility, but also with ambition. Marine carbon removal and ocean alkalinity enhancement in particular may or ultimately may not be one of the answers or one of the important tools, but we will not answer that question by standing still. We will answer it by doing the science, building the governance, establishing the MRV, engaging the public honestly, and then making evidence-based decisions. That, in my view, is the opportunity before Canada, not to rush, not to posture, but to lead and to lead responsibly. The opportunity is there. We simply need the foresight and the courage to seize it. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here today.